sure we have, good quality and all of that. So again, let me just go over a couple of logistics. I apologize to those of you who will hear it for the third time. Those of you who joined in the minutes leading up to our start time saw a slide that indicated key buttons thank you, Logan, that will allow you to participate if you are on screen. Down in the left-hand corner is a chat button, so you can use that to submit questions and comments as we get to that part of the program. And up in the upper right-hand corner, you have some choices as to layout for this. It's sort of the second button from the right. We're suggesting that you choose speaker view as the most effective way to participate in this event. Please note that you are on the phone and listening to the conversation. We're glad you're here, but unfortunately we don't have a way for you to add your questions or comments at this point. I would like to thank the Dignity USA staff who has been working on this event and thank them for being here tonight. Peggy Burns, Logan Baer, and our newest member, Danielle Walsh. So everybody's been chipping in and helping us get ready, so thank you so much for all that you've brought to this event. In a few moments, I will introduce our two invited guests to kick off the discussion with their perspectives, and after each of them has spoken, we'll open the floor to you. We are really interested in getting as broad a sense of reactions to this book and the public discussion around it as possible, so your voices really are important to this process. Again, if you have something you'd like, either a question to direct to the speakers or a comment, please use the chat button and we'll get that up and into the conversation after the initial overview. And before we begin, I'd just like to take a moment to dedicate tonight's session to the memory of Bill Welch, a Dignity USA member from San Jose, California, who was a faithful and enthusiastic participant in our video chat program called Queer Catholic Faith for all of the time that program ran, and who served the organization and the LGBTQI Catholic community of Northern California for decades. Bill passed away in September after battling health issues for many years. Those of you who participated in the QCF program probably remember Bill and his comments and warm greetings to folks as they joined. So we're grateful for the chance to have known him and his many contributions, and just want to take a moment to remember him tonight. So now turning to the reason we're here. Building a Bridge has generated a great deal of discussion, some would say controversy, about LGBTQI Catholics and the official church since its release this summer. Dignity USA members and friends are among those who have strong opinions about this book's place in the library of books, articles, and discussions about this issue. To help facilitate this conversation, we've invited two people whose review of Building a Bridge stood out for their clarity, thoughtfulness, and cogency. Nicholas Caffardi is one of the preeminent canon lawyers in the U.S. and a former professor of law and dean emeritus at Duquesne University School of Law in Pittsburgh, coincidentally where Dignity USA will be holding its next board meeting in early November. Nick has worked for the Diocese of Pittsburgh and was the founding chair of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's Commission on Racial and Gender Bias and was a guiding co-author of its massive report on racial and gender bias in the justice system. Nick was also an original member of the United States Catholic Bishops' National Review Board for the Protection of Children and Youth and served as its chair from 2004 to 2005. Dr. Caffardi's review, Building a Bridge by Father James Martin, Seeks Respect Between Church and LGBT Community, appeared in the June 27, 2017 issue of America Magazine. Nick, we're very happy to welcome you to this conversation, which I believe is also your first Dignity USA event. Our other discussion leader is someone whose expertise and insight Dignity USA taps into quite frequently. Jamie Manson, writer, retreat leader, speaker, and a columnist and books editor for the National Catholic Reporter, holds an MDiv from Yale Divinity School. She has addressed several Dignity USA chapters, led our young adults retreat, and has been a featured speaker at a number of national conferences. Most recently, Jamie was part of the plenary panel at our conference this summer, speaking about storytelling and public discourse and what happens when previously marginalized voices enter the conversation, a panel many have said was the most powerful session ever presented at one of our gatherings. Jamie's review, Can Father Martin's Bridge Hold Up?, was published by NCR on July 5th, 2017. I urge you, if you haven't already done so, to read both of these pieces. So Nick, let's start with you. You found this book to be a significant step in Catholic discussion on LGBTQI issues. Can you tell us what spoke to you?
Well, I really liked Father Martin's book very much, but I like almost everything that Jim Martin writes. He's a phenomenal author. And I think the book was courageous. This is a topic that can end careers in our church. This is a topic that we take great risks writing about. And we've seen the price that Father Martin has begun to pay. He's already been disinvited from 3 speaking engagements, one of them at the Catholic University of America Theology School. And so I admire his courage in addressing the topic. It's one that we tread around very gingerly in our church today, probably because we have such a terrible record of how the church has treated LGBTQ people in our history. That's why I thought what Father Martin's book, which really simply asks us to have a respectful dialogue between the LGBTQ community and the church, was something worth writing about, certainly something worth doing. And Martin does a really good job in describing how that should happen. We have some very unfortunate language in the Catechism of the Catholic Church about LGBT conduct being intrinsically disordered. I mean, that's a terrible way to describe the center of a person's being. It's a terrible way to describe what a loving relationship is not. And so, Martin is writing in a time and a place where the church has been treating LGBTQ people with disparagement, with disdain, with condemnation, and that unfortunate language, in the Catechism. But then he goes on to say that the Catechism also says that we must treat the LGBTQ community with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Those are actually the words of the Catechism. And then in his book, he gives examples of that, which I think are very meaningful in terms of the respect that you give people simply because of who they are, the compassion you give people because they've been discriminated against and have been hurt, and then the sensitivity to see people where they are as they are. And here, I think he does a really good job of bringing in Pope Francis's famous word, accompaniment. You need to accompany people where they are. And then he switches gears, and he asks, how can the LGBTQ community, how can they respect the church? How can they show compassion to the church? How can they show sensitivity towards the church? And here I think things get a little bit dicey, because at this point, he's really asking people who have been discriminated against terribly and for such a long time to respect the institution that is the source of that discrimination. I mean, I think that's a bold move on his part. And I think he handles it well. He does explain that in terms of respect, the church today is paying the price for being very, countercultural in the way it still speaks of LGBTQ relationships. Uh, and in terms of compassion, just realizing that we're really dealing with men who have been taken almost by surprise by the very quick change in our culture. And then sensitivity, I mean, they are human beings, huh? And they're looking for a way to solve these issues, I think, as much as anybody. Uh, but after that, and this is interesting because almost all the reviews ignored this, half of the book are Father Martin's spiritual meditations, scriptural meditations. It is a truism to say that in times of trouble, in times when people are suffering, Scripture is a phenomenal source of strength. And so his 10 scriptural meditations, I really thought were the best part of the book. And he does a really great job in using Scripture to help both sides of this bridge see ways that they can approach each other and approach the dialogue. His quote from St. Paul in 1 Corinthians, everybody, we have different gifts in our church. But most importantly, we all need each other. The story that the eye cannot function without the ear. We need each other. Then his story of the Good Samaritan, again, the idea that we have to, the Christ says we need to stand with the marginalized. We need to stand with the victimized. They're very powerful stories. And I thought really were the best, the strongest part of the book. I end up in my review by saying, Father Martin talks really about a change in tone. He doesn't talk about a change in teaching. And I speculate that perhaps what's really needed is, in fact, a change in teaching. But sometimes changes in teaching in our church are very hard to achieve. But you can start them with changes in tone. And I think that's what the Father Martin did. So I found the book very helpful. I think it does advance the dialogue. I know that we those of us who see the situation for what it really is would like to see things move much more quickly. But I do think that Martin deserves a lot of praise for what is a very courageous book, given where our church is today.
Thank you, Nick. I think you gave us a lot of things that we will circle back to think about that, and appreciate your pointing out the scriptural reflections, which I think you're right, hasn't gotten as much attention as many of the other components in the book. So an important piece to bring up for us. Thank you. Great. Jamie, you also call out some positive aspects of the book and also some reservations about it. Can you say where you see this fit in our current landscape?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Nick. That was an excellent summary of the book. Very helpful. I think there's a few points that I really struggle with about the book. And the first one is how much Martin downplays the not only the spiritual, but the political violence that's being waged, particularly on LGBTQ people in the U.S. And I'm talking about this from a very American, context. Because he makes some very bold claims that the bishops want to be pastoral to LGBTQ people, but they're just confused as to how to do that, and that they do stand with us. And there is just such a remarkable amount of evidence to suggest otherwise that I thought that claim really needed to be questioned. Martin says that the bishops he knows are very supportive. Now, he is in a very privileged place in the church, and he speaks twice about how some of his very good friends are cardinals and bishops, and they've always been very kind to him. But, when you look at the fact that the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, their two top priorities are defending religious liberty and defending traditional marriage. Both of those have LGBTQ people in their crosshairs, both of those campaigns. And they're very well-oiled campaigns, and they're very politically charged. And so it's very hard for me to accept that bishops, are just confused. Because even if a bishop isn't a culture warrior and is actively attacking LGBTQ people, the fact that they remain silent when those are the top two agendas of the conference that represents them, I find that very problematic. So that was one of my main concerns about the book, that it gives a lot of credit to the bishops and gives the bishops a benefit of the doubt that I don't think they have earned at all. We're not being passively ignored as LGBTQ people. We're being actively campaigned against. And it's right there. You just have to go to the website of the USCCB and see that. My other struggle about the second part of the book, particularly where Martin says that LGBTQ people need to treat the church leaders with respect and compassion and sensitivity, he says that we should really try to earn the trust of our bishops. He says if you want to get something done, really earn the trust of our bishops. And I struggled with that mightily. And that has to do with a claim he makes earlier in the book, in which he says, a lot of priests are gay, but they're not out, or maybe they dealt with the same shame, that a lot of LGBTQ people deal with. And it's, to me, the struggle is if the bishops were genuinely naive about LGBTQ people and gay life, and, this would be the book would be for me a little bit more reasonable. But we know, and Martin himself admits, that many priests are gay, and women religious are lesbian. And maybe there are even trans people. I'm sure there are among the clergy. And so they are aware of who we are. In fact, some of them are partnered. Some of them are in loving same-sex relationships. And so that, to me, is the struggle, is that it's the hypocrisy and the abuse of power. And so to ask LGBTQ people to trust something that is so hypocritical, I really struggle with. And I struggle with the idea of how spiritually healthy that is for LGBTQ people, honestly, to trust people that are actively campaigning or agreeing or being silent in the midst of an active campaign against us, and who are not being forthcoming and not being vulnerable. So Martin asks us to ask for dialogue, to be vulnerable, to be self-disclosive, but the same is not asked of the clergy. And that really is the problem, is there's an imbalance of power and there's not a mutuality in this dialogue. The last point I'll make is that people have said that Martin is very courageous, and I think one of my struggles with the book is that there have been many courageous priests, not many courageous priests, but many courageous LGBTQ lay people, and several courageous priests and women religious. And we have been trying to have dialogue with the institutional church for 50 years now, and we have vigiled and prayed and written letters, and we have not been listened to. And so it's not a new thing to ask for dialogue. It's not a new thing, to approach the institution with compassion and with sensitivity. We have been trying this for decades. And so I don't think there's no sense of honoring the prophets and the peacemakers of the LGBT community who have come before this book. And that I really struggle with, because this is not a new concept at all. And so I struggle with his ideas on prophecy quite a bit. Toward the end of the book, he says, really, you can't be an angry prophet unless you're John the Baptist or Jesus, a saint or sinless. That's really troubling for me too. The first part of the book concludes that way. So a lot of, things go for me unanswered or, not really accounted for in the book. And so I have struggled with it quite a bit. I have more, obviously, that I'd love to say about it, but I think as we have dialogue, those other ideas will come forward. So I'll close for now. Thank you.
Great. Jamie, thank you so much for taking that perspective and showing us some of the limitations that you have found in the book. I guess as folks are thinking of your own reactions and starting to type in questions, I'd like to pick up on something you ended with, Jamie, and invite both Nick and Jamie to comment on how this book is playing in the current climate in terms of both, I think, not picking up or not honoring a lot of the history that has already been out there, but yet still being seen as something new and something really controversial in a church that is clearly split in some ways. I'm not suggesting that our church is evenly divided on this, because we know that most U.S. Catholics do support same-sex couples, support rights for transgendered people, are really much more progressive than sort of the image of our church would be. But why does it remain so controversial at this point? And as Jamie and Nick are responding, please, I do welcome folks who are participating to start sending in your comments and questions.
I think it's unfortunate but true, given the history that Jamie just recited, that this is still such a neuralgic area in our church. I'd like to give Martin credit, though, I think, for writing a book that is just as much addressed to the bishops as anybody else. I realize that too many of our bishops are still culture warriors. And the idea that we're making a priority at the USCCB of trying to fight against same-sex marriage, trying to create a religious exception for the ability to discriminate against gay and lesbian persons. I wish our church were not there. I truly do. I think it sends out all the wrong signals about being the welcoming home of people who want to live their life in Christ. But don't underestimate Martin here. I think he understands all this. He's certainly a highly intelligent person. I think he knows the status quo. I think he knows that we have been at this, as Jamie said, for quite a long time. And for the people who have suffered under this discrimination by the church, too long a time. But we need to move off the dime, and I think books like Martin's help us move off the dime. I think he as much gives the bishops reasons to engage in dialogue to get them away from their crazy culture warrior stance as anything in this book, and don't underestimate that.
Okay, Jamie, did you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I think it's important to say that in terms of the stance that Martin's taken, much was made of his being uninvited from a couple of talks, and I think it's important to remember that after that, in response, a number of bishops stood behind him, and one of the most important cardinals now in the U.S., Cardinal Cupich in Chicago, invited him to speak. That's remarkable, and no one else I know no one in our community, certainly the Dignity community, has been defended in that way. And many of us, many of us who are leaders, LGBTQ leaders, Catholic leaders, never get invited to speak at all. And I think that's something we have to look at more closely. There was this sense that, that Father Martin is not trying to start trouble, and he's just trying to do the right thing, and there's almost an implication there that the rest of us who have been struggling for this equality or this dialogue for LGBTQ people still aren't welcome to the table because somehow we're not as orthodox, and so I think that's something to really pay attention to is what's being communicated when we say he should be there. But people who are openly gay and in same-sex relationships still don't have a place at the table, and maybe shouldn't have a place at the table is sort of what that implies. And I think, the reason that this remains such a massive issue is, I think it's two things. First, I think it reflects on the lives of the priests and bishops who have their own issues with their own sexuality. And Martin himself says in the book that they go into the priesthood, some of them to hide from their sexuality. He admits that, which I think is a very good part of the book. So I think that, I think we're human beings are self-centered enough, all of us, that if we react strongly to something, it must be pushing our own buttons. So I think that it's pushing their buttons. And the larger issue is, the theology is, even the Pope Francis's theology is a theology of complementarity, meaning that, unless we start to really think theologically, to dismantle this theology of the idea that God has a purpose for men and God has a purpose for women, I think we're going to keep suffering these kinds of injustices. A change in tone isn't going to change theology. A change in tone isn't going to stop these political campaigns against us. We really have to take a look at what we're saying about men and women and how reasonable that is given what we know about biology and science and gender. So.
I'm sorry. Were you going to say something, Nick?
No, I was going to agree with Jamie that Martin does say a number of things about the sexuality of priests and bishops, and again, I think in a subtle way of moving them off the dime, of moving them a bit forward in the discussions that have to take place here, and I think again, Jamie makes a good point. Martin gets into rooms because of his Roman collar that I, as a layperson, would not be invited into, that Jamie would not be invited into for, I guess, a few reasons that she would be able to give us. And that's, when you think about that, we lay people are 99% of the church. It would look very silly, if the church was just priests and bishops. So why aren't we there? But again, I want to give Martin credit. I think his book, is really edging to a point of saying that how can you have a dialogue with somebody who's not in the room? We need to be in the room, huh? The LGBTQ community needs to be in that room with the bishops. I think Martin's book is more subversive, maybe, than we realize, and I think it's good. I think because he's subverting the right things. He's subverting centuries of unreasonable prejudice.
Thank you. Okay, there are lots and lots of comments and questions coming in. I'm going to kind of start from the top, so this may feel a little bit disjointed. I apologize for that because folks are clearly responding to things as they move on. But we have a question from John, who I believe is our theology student from Texas here. Do we think that a change in tone necessarily precedes a change in teaching? I believe that sometimes a change in tone can be used to uphold oppression or soften the blow of oppressive church teaching. We certainly have heard that about Francis. Is he saying this, sort of like that Southern, stab in the back, but then bless y'all kind of thing. But yeah, so change in tone and how that relates to change in church teaching.
Did you want us to respond to that, Marianne?
Yeah, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I agree with John very much, and that's why I say that it's very hard to imagine how we can really have a bridge when we're in very different places. There is such a lack of mutuality of power at work here, and we're expected to bare our souls and we're expected to be vulnerable, and they still have all the power. I've been really troubled. Bishop McElroy keeps saying this, that there's, he keeps saying that there's prejudice on both sides, on the LGBTQ side and on the bishop side. And I can't believe he doesn't, hear the reverberations of what Trump said. We're not oppressing the bishops. We don't have the spiritual and religious power or the political power that they have, in their own realm, with evangelicals and with certain segments of the Republican Party. And so to say that, we're trying to defend ourselves against, this theology that says that we're inadequate, we're unnatural, our love is not equal to the love of heterosexuals, and never can be part of God's plan. So yeah, I mean, there's such a high risk of just being condescended to, being treated like we have a wound. I've always struggled with that idea that we're wounded and we need to be brought in and our wounds have to be mended, because what Pope Francis always says after that is, and then we'll talk about the chronic conditions later. Listen to the language. Yeah, I absolutely agree with John. Yeah.
Okay. There are a number of questions that have to do kind of with the issue of privilege and clericalism. I'll kind of string a few of those together here. From Danielle, to what, I mean, we've talked a little bit about this, but to what extent does Martin acknowledge heterosexual privilege, clerical privilege? Does he disclose his own sexual orientation in the book and name his privilege? Dugan also, talks about the fact that the idea that a priest is saying this somehow means more than when we say it ourselves. Why can't he defer to us and quote some of us in our work? And a question from John in Massachusetts, puzzled why James Martin doesn't mention John McNeill and his groundbreaking work on being gay and Catholic. So, again, sort of the position of privilege that this is written from and how that plays into the dynamic. And does Martin address, or why do you think he doesn't address some of these pioneers or folks who've been in the trenches doing this work for a long time? I suppose, obviously, it'd be best to direct that question to James himself at some point, but it's an observation that is running through the thread here.
Well, it's a good observation. I don't think Martin was trying to write a history of the problem. If he had, then I'm sure he's a good enough scholar, he would have quoted the people who've gone before him. Clerical privilege is a problem in our church. It's a problem with how the church treats the LGBTQ community. But you know what? It's also a problem with the way they treat the heterosexual community. Since Humanae Vitae, couples when they are intimate with each other cannot use artificial means of contraception. And why? Because the clerics say so. This is not a problem that's unique to the gay and lesbian community. We have a clerical church. We have a church where the power is in the hands of the ordained.
I would just say that I think there is something unique about the issue with LGBTQ people, because we actually have gays oppressing gays. And that's really interesting to me. These are celibate men, and maybe 40% of them are gay, and they're actively oppressing us. And so that's unique, I think, in the pelvic zone realm of pelvic zone issues.
I'd also like to bring Sarah's voice in here. She says, one thing I was really struck by was how talk-oriented James Martin's book was. What would action on the part of the church look like? Bridge building is active. Any response to that? I think that's a really important point.
That's a good point. He doesn't get there. She's absolutely right. He doesn't get to the action part. It is very talk-oriented. He's talking about a dialogue, and what would things look like when we get to the action part? Well, the action part has to finally be that change in teaching. That's the action part. Changes in teaching in our church come very, very difficultly. Changes in tone are easier. Again, to Jamie's point, though, sometimes changes in tone are simply a way to mask absolutely no action at all. And if I think that that's all Martin was talking about was tone to mask no action, I would not have liked the book as much as I did, because I really do think he's talking about tone to start some kind of change in behavior, change in teaching. Again, it has to be very difficult being the person discriminated against, being told, well, let's just start by talking. That has to be very difficult. I don't have an answer for that.
I think one of the most important things that if we do get dialogue is to get away from this notion of that the hierarchy is showing us mercy. One of the things I struggle with in the second part of Martin's book is this idea that the LGBT person is always seen as the sinner, the Zacchaeus or the tax collector. We're always in that position where, well, Jesus was merciful to everyone. Well, I don't think I'm actually sinning by being in love with a woman. I don't think that being committed, being in love is a sin, and it's not in need. It's not something that requires mercy. And so I think that if a dialogue is going to happen, it has to come from a place of justice, of recognizing that we are good and holy, and that our loves have as much potential to be good and holy and blessed by God as any heterosexual relationship. So I think that as the one thing I would say in terms of action is, if the institution does not come at this from a place of justice and only a place of, well, we're showing you mercy because you're one of those sinners from the outside that has to be brought in, I don't think the dialogue can really work.
Yeah. One of the other comments here talks about a place that the bishops would need to start was with a really heartfelt recognition of the pain and damage that they have caused for so long. And I'll just say, knowing as an advocate in this field for years, to even get the bishops to, or any church officials to talk about condemning violence. I mean, you think that would be a place that any religious person, never mind a church leader, should be able to get to, but even to call for an action around condemning violence towards people based on whom they are, what they look like, whom they love, who they're in relationship, has been a non-starter with there. So it's hard to imagine, there are calls in here about asking or having the bishops stop opposing us in the political realm as a potential action. Lots of things that folks are wishing for, hoping for, and that should be a realistic expectation. But we're clearly very far from those places.
I wonder if the bishops realize that their campaigns against the legalization of same-sex marriage and their campaign for the religious freedom to be able to discriminate against the LGBTQ community. I wonder if they realize that does open the door to violence. It does, because what you're saying is that this is unacceptable behavior. This is sinful behavior. And once you say something is evil, the next step is to do violence to it. I wonder if they realize that. And I think, but Martin sort of makes this point, because he starts the book by talking about the Pulse mass murder in Orlando, and he says he was surprised that how very few bishops condemned that violence. It turned out to be very few, and that's what spurred him to write the book, which is the point I was making earlier. I think this book is addressed as much to the bishops as to anybody, and asking them to reconsider, where they've been, what they've done, what they've said, and the effect it's had.
Yeah, there are certainly folks, Bernard Lynch springs to mind as somebody who said, until the bishops repent for every person who has died of AIDS, and every person who has suffered violence and murder, that there is no starting point, because there's a lot of lives that are, that many would lay at the feet of the institutional church. Yeah.
In terms of violence, Marianne, in the 1986 letter to the bishops of the Catholic Church on the pastoral care of homosexual persons actually says, don't be surprised. This is literally from the bishop's mouth. Don't be surprised when advances in gay rights lead to increase in anti-gay violence. Now that's something to repent for, and they have not repented for that statement. And that's so far as I know, that statement still holds.
It does, and it was repeated in 91, 92, right out of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Right, that's, if folks are agitating for rights, don't be surprised if violence is the result. It's there's some really tough stuff that needs to be confronted here. Yeah.
That statement from the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith is extremely poorly phrased and extremely unfortunate in the way it in its thought process. I mean, well, think about what would your mentality be that's saying the more you struggle for your rights, the more we're going to oppress you. My goodness.
Yeah.
But Nick, that's what's happening right now is our struggle for rights. We are seeing backlash with the religious liberty fight, with the fighting against same-sex marriage. This is the same thing. We're struggling for rights, and they're fighting back against us. So, the violence continues as far as I can see.
I don't disagree with you. Again, once you identify a certain type of behavior as evil, you open the door for people to go after those evildoers. That is what is so wrong about the culture wars. That's what is so wrong about our bishops being culture warriors. I don't think they realize. I hope they don't realize the violence that they're doing. This is not theoretical violence. This is real violence, and to the extent the teachings of my church support that, we need to repent.
Yeah, we need a lot more than a change in tone.
Yeah, but again, that still doesn't make me dislike or criticize Martin's book. I think he knew what he was doing. I think he was prodding the bishops, again, because he knows that they need to be prodded. Now, again, we're in a hierarchical church. These guys have way more power than we do. But goodness gracious, all we're asking them to do is read the Gospels and act accordingly.
Yeah. I guess one question that I would pose to both of you, and that's kind of coming through some of these questions, is, how can the bishops claim to remain so ignorant? I mean, there are newspapers, there are people on their staff that they talk to. Bishops have queer people in their families. There's all kinds of educational resources that are out there. Why is it a book like this that gets this kind of reaction? Yeah, I mean, there have been, LGBTQI groups offering to talk with church officials about our lives, about our struggles, about the blessings of our relationships, our families, our faith, our identities, for decades. And all of this has turned a blind eye. So will this book crack through, do you think?
It's hard to say what will crack through. I think the reaction to the McCarthy-like tactics against Martin on the part of some very prominent bishops are a good sign. But most of our bishops are still culture warriors, and until that way of being a bishop changes, I don't know, Marianne, what will break that wall. But goodness gracious, it needs to be broken, because the effect of the current situation is way too much suffering.
I think the book is successful because it's a very safe book, and it does quite a bit to, assert the authority of the bishops. And it really treats them with, very, very softly. And it doesn't, it doesn't go into, the real depth of what's going on politically and what's going on spiritually with these bishops. So it doesn't really call them to accountability, it asks them to do very little. And so I think that it's digestible for them. And again, it perpetuates this idea that LGBTQ people somehow are equally unjust toward the bishops, and that just simply doesn't make sense with that level of power imbalance. So I think that's why it's palatable for the bishops. But again, who's getting to talk about it? Well, Jim Martin he has not declared his sexual orientation, and he is a celibate priest. He claims to be, and that's who gets in. And I think that's why it's safe. But it gets for me, it gets very tiresome to have, ostensibly celibate clerics constantly battling it out about my day-to-day life, my living reality, the living reality of my friends and family. So at some point, this is, I think, going to get wearying. I know it is wearying for already a number of LGBTQ people. So.
And we do have a comment who actually, sort of takes the flip side of that. This is from George, also in Texas, saying, that there is a value to having someone who takes that sort of middle position, almost an ambassadorial position, so that the message becomes the focus rather than the individual. And that, we have to acknowledge that there are some folks who have that abilities to speak from inside the network. So just a comment that speaks to the value of that.
What's the value?
Yeah, I agree. But it's time for some of us to get in on the conversation too. That always strikes me with Pope Francis. He speaks to everyone from Leonardo DiCaprio, to evangelical Christians, to Orthodox bishops, and he never invites any of us, any of us who are struggling for justice, for women, for LGBTQ people, for sex abuse. It's time for us to finally get a seat at the table.
Isn't that what Martin is saying should happen in the book? Isn't he saying that dialogue needs to take place?
Well, yes, but he doesn't say how, and and he doesn't give any practical examples for how that can happen. And again, there has to be a certain level of mutuality that happens in the conversation. And I don't really I see him as calling for us to finally get to bare our souls to the bishops, and maybe hopefully they'll listen. Again, there's not any inequality, and there's not a real, a mutuality that we need of self-disclosure and honesty, and it's very hard to bare your souls to people that know exactly what you're talking about already. And so I think he asks for a lot of vulnerability on the part of LGBTQ people and not much on the part of bishops.
It reminds me of a quote from the recent Dignity Convention where Pamela Lightsey, our keynote speaker, who's an out queer Methodist elder, talked about, when you take a seat at the table, know if you're a guest or on the menu. Kind of thing, which I think is an important warning. We have Duke in here speculating. I'm wondering if James Martin would like to be able to discuss his own